Good morning and welcome to History of Interiors. Today we're going to begin looking at French styles, specifically focusing on the French Renaissance. This will feature a lot of similar elements to the Italian Renaissance that we just studied, but most elements will be interpreted in a new way. Alright, so diving into some important people of the French Renaissance, we have Francis I, who initiated the Renaissance in France, and he actually took the time to almost recruit Leonardo da Vinci and Vignola to France to come and make masterpieces there as well. And then we see Louis XII and Louis XIII, as well as Henry II and Henry IV. So each of these people are incredibly influential. They were part of the aristocracy and the royal family. Therefore, they had a lot of communication with people outside of France that the average everyday citizens just wouldn't have had. And so because of that, they had the ability to interact with a lot of other art forms. And they became really important because they took the time to invest in those art forms and make sure that France had a really strong center for the arts, therefore exerting French influence throughout the world as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some important structures, and the main thing that we're going to be looking at today are chateaus, which really come into prominence during this time. They do serve the same role as the Italian villa that we've discussed several times, but these would be a country home. They were really lavish and large, and they were often commissioned by those members of the nobility and aristocracy. So we're going to be looking at three main chateaus today, and I do want to apologize really quickly. I do not speak French, so some of these pronunciations are going to be a little bit rough, but hopefully we can all get through this together. So you have the Chateau of Chambord, the Chateau of Fontainebleau, and the Chateau of Vlos. And all of these are commissioned by Francis I, so he's really going to be the main figure of the Italian Renaissance just because he did bring it to France, making it a really influential movement, and so his commissions are going to be some of the most prominent that we will look at. Okay, so on this slide you see an image of the Chateau de Chambord, and as you can tell, it has a water feature, which is pretty common for chateaus. Most of them would have had some sort of water feature. They are out in the country, so they would have needed access to water and food as well, but mostly as a sign of beauty. One of the main features of this structure that I really want you to pay attention to are all of these round turrets. So the circle is a pretty popular thing that we're going to see on these French chateaus, the use of things that are round rather than rectangular. So you can see, like I said, lots of those throughout. Alright, so now we are moving on to Fontainebleau. Once again, you can see another one of those water features. So when Fontainebleau was built, it was actually intended to be a hunting lodge for people to go and stay at while they had their elaborate hunts. It has been added on to several times. It was initially much smaller than this, but it has been built up several times, just to make it a really expansive, quite impressive chateau. However, these were additions that were made at different times by different rulers, so while it has become a quite large structure, and it's relatively uniform, you can still tell that there's a little bit of differences between each piece. These are the gardens of Le Notre, and you can tell that they are absolutely beautiful. Le Notre was actually involved in the Italian Renaissance as well, so he did a lot of those grottos or really elaborate gardens. And France will become quite famous for their use of parterre gardens throughout. So you make a form of landscape that is just as impressive as the buildings that are there as well. So, like I said, these are incredibly beautiful, beautiful gardens. And these gardens were extremely formal, so they were intended to, like I said before, show how elaborate and powerful and really enhance the beauty of the landscape around the chateau. All right, so this is the Horse Court, sorry, and it is the main entrance into Fontainebleau. And you can see the horseshoe staircase that goes around the front. And that's what it's most known for. So it definitely gave the idea of what this space was intended to be used for, and gave it a kind of signature piece right on the front. And this is just a little bit of a closer view of that horseshoe staircase. So, like I said, it definitely adds something that says a lot about what this building or gardens are intended to be, and gives it a really signature piece out front to signify what this space was. All right, so this is the Lake of the Carp, and it runs around those gardens and that chateau as well. Um, So, as you can tell, it's just an incredibly beautiful water feature. And water, like I said, would have been absolutely necessary. Everyone needs it to survive. Um, but they also wanted to incorporate that in a way that added to the beauty of the overall space rather than just leaving like a little pond out in a field somewhere. So on this slide, you can see a mansard roof with dormers, and this would become a signature of the French style far beyond the Renaissance as well. It's something that French buildings often use, and you can definitely look at them and tell when you see this roof style that it is a distinctively French building. So these roofs are very tapered and they have a very intense slant to them. So rather than being your traditional gabled roof, they are actually much steeper and much more tapered and tailored. And on this image, you can also see those little dormers peeking out. So these are going to be just some important vocabulary terms for you to know as we go through the French styles. So this is just a different angle of that chateau, but as you can tell, this would have been quite the expansive building project, and so it's been added onto several times. It wasn't necessarily all built at once. And this structure has a quite expansive history just because it has been passed down through all of the different rulers that have come into power in France. So not only do you see this used by Francis I, who initiated the building of this project, we also see all of the different Louis and Henrys using this as well, all the way through and actually past the days of Napoleon rising to power. All right, so now that we've talked about the structures a little bit, we're going to move on to the interior features. So these buildings were incredibly large in scale, which kind of serves as a form of hierarchy of scale. So the rich, the nobles, the kings would have had these giant, elaborate homes and floor plans that were quite expansive. So the interiors would need to be really large scale to give off that air of importance. We also see the use of a tall wainscot on the walls, which was definitely influenced by the Gothic style. So we can see that traced through here. And remember that the Gothic style is known for being French as well. So while we saw that in other areas of the world, it was primarily France that did that style, and therefore we're seeing its influence be stronger in France than we see it elsewhere. So they make their wainscots using plaster and tapestries. The tapestries would sit above the wainscot, and we'll see a picture of this in just a moment. They also used herringbone parquet on the floor, so it's the pattern that's still in style right now, but we often do it with tile. However, the herringbone floor is quite popular during the French Renaissance. We also see beamed and coffered ceilings. These beams are often painted. Um, and so, once again, this is something that is a signature to French style. We see it quite often, um, and it remains popular. We also see the use of hooded fireplaces going back to that Gothic influence. However, these are going to be a little bit more fanciful and pretty. We also see casement windows. And so, casement windows, just to remind you all, they open more like a door. The hinge is on the side. It's not going to slide up and down like most windows that we have today. So, the French really used that casement window to their advantage. All right, so in this image, you can see the interior of that chateau that we just looked at. This is the inside of Fontainebleau, and going back to all of the things that we just discussed, you can tell that this is incredibly large in scale, and you can also see this large section here, which is the wainscot. You also have, I believe they're paintings above in this one, but sometimes you would see that as tapestries. And you can also see the herringbone pattern on the floor, especially if you look at the way the light hits it. It almost looks like stripes in this specific setting. And then you also can see the beamed and coffered ceilings up here in this large section. And then the elements that we're missing in this specific piece are those casement windows and the hooded fireplace. But everything else you can see here. You can also see this little F motif, which signifies that this was built for Francis I. He often tried to display his motif and his family emblem as much as possible. And this would have been incredibly common of rulers and really any form of the nobility to do as they were building these large and lavish homes. So here's another view, and you can see the ceiling a bit better here, as well as being able to tell how richly painted these were. So they tried to add in definitely as much detail as possible. And you can really see that featured here, especially in the ceiling. Just look at how incredibly elaborate that is. You can also see many different panels here, so several just all lined up in a row along this line here. And essentially, this room serves as an incredibly long hallway. So to see panel after panel after panel after panel definitely added some sophistication to this space. It made it seem as large and as long as it was, which really exhibits the grandeur of the space. This room is a bit more typical into what we think of when we think of a hunting lodge. You can see all of the different sets of antlers, as well as a more simplified fireplace. And you also see a much simpler ceiling here, right? So you've got the beams of wood that are just stained. You don't have that elaborate carving and painting element to these. So now we're going to dive into furniture, and to give you the briefest overview of it, you have oak and walnut being the main forms of wood that are used to create these pieces. In general, they are absolutely massive, so they're not necessarily scaled for the people that would be using them, but rather to show off that mass and that power. And we also see the use of straight lines throughout. So this is going to be before, I know personally when I think of French interiors, my mind goes more to the Rococo interiors of Beauty and the Beast. But these would have actually used very straight and linear lines rather than curvilinear lines, which the French will become popular for in a later date. All right, so now we're going to look at the more specific pieces of furniture that we see in the French Renaissance. So first we still got those wainscot chairs, which you'll remember from the Gothic era. They stick around. Um, then we have the Escabel chair, which is like the Scabello that we saw in the Italian Renaissance. It's a pretty boxy chair. We also have an armoire, which is borrowed from Italy and is used as a closet. We have the sedia, which features turned legs. It's quite rectangular, and we'll get a closer look on that later. The cockatois for women in the large skirts. So those hoop skirts would have been quite popular at the time, and this allows them a way to sit properly. Then we have the trestle table, which we looked at a little bit during the Italian Renaissance to go over the like refectory tables. So they're the ones that were often used in a monastery. They've got the two trestles with a beam in between for stability. And then lastly, we have a credence, which is really just a small side table, but it's often used in churches to hold the elements of the Eucharist before they are consecrated. All right, so we're going to dive in by looking at the cockatois, which would have been used by women in their large and lavish skirts. So you can tell that the seat is much wider towards the front, where all of that fabric would need to be. And these would have been chairs that were specifically built so that these women would have a place to sit. Now we have a piece that most of y'all are probably pretty familiar with. This is an armoire. And it serves the same role as a closet, but rather than being like a built-in room in your space, you would just use this piece of furniture. On this specific one, you can see that those architectural elements are also featured in the furniture. So this is another armoire, but you can tell that this one has more classical motifs. So you can see those people down here, like in motion, in action, and they follow those same elements that the classical designs would have used. All right, so on this side, you can see three different styles. So the first one that you see up here in the upper left-hand corner is the credence. So like I said, that's just like a small side table. And then we've got the armoire here. So that's going to be on your right-hand side. And the trestle table on the bottom. So that one, it almost comes in, it looks a little bit like a pedestal at first, but this area here in the middle would have actually served as a means of putting a beam in between the two trestles to give this table extra stability. And on this slide, we just have some of those pieces that we just discussed, so you can go ahead and start reviewing. And all of these pieces should be on your vocabulary sheet as well, so if you need any additional help, that would be a great resource for you to look at. All right, so the French were quite impressive with all of their ornament that they included everywhere. So just as we saw in the Gothic style and how absolutely elaborate that was, we're going to see a lot of elements here as well. So it's not quite as simplified as the Italian Renaissance intended to be. So a lot of these we're going to have seen before, so we're not going to spend too much time on them, but I do want to go through them each. So you have the linen fold, which if you'll remember is just a carving that looks like linen. Then you have a salamander, which was used by Henry I, and oftentimes the rulers would find something from nature, such as an animal like the salamander, to signify them, almost as a little signature of themselves. So then you also have the monogram where they would put the first letter of their name as also a means of signature and signifying that that space was theirs. We also see elaborate and heavy carvings featured throughout. On many of the furniture pieces, we see bun feet, which just look like little balls that the furniture sits up on. And then we also see some pointed arches, but not as many as we saw during the Gothic period. One new thing that really takes flight here is the fleur-de-lis. And this is a symbol that I'm pretty sure you have all seen before. It is very much associated with the French style. And then we also see Atlantids and Caryatids, which if you'll remember are those statuette style columns. We have the cartouche, the laurel leaf, the acanthus leaf, and niches, as well as the arabesque elements. And all of those you have seen before, so if you need a refresher, you can go back and look at some of our past lectures. But the one thing that the French really made some great strides in were textile development. So they used several different types of textiles throughout, including velvet, damask, Cordovan leather, and fringe, all of which were quite popular during this time. So we mentioned this earlier when we were looking back at that hunting lodge, but you can see the motif here. This is the monogrammed F, signifying that this space was commissioned by Francis I. Alright, so this is technically a piece of furniture. It is that credence, but you can see a lot of the elements that we spoke about. You've got a lot of the arabesque elements, you've got the caryatids, but like I said, it's heavily elaborate. There's lots of carving happening here, and it's definitely very French in its style, and we can tell that based on the motifs used as well as the shape of the overall piece of furniture. Alright, so one last interior. This is going to be the last thing that we look at today. And you can see all of those elements that we talked about when we spoke about the interiors earlier. So you have the beamed ceiling and the hooded fireplace. We can also see the use of columns throughout, as well as the ogive arch, which we talked about during the Gothic period. And you can also see the use of the fleur-de-lis as part of the decorative elements here. So now we have discussed the French Renaissance, and we will be back in a little bit with a different lecture going into some of the other French styles. So French styles move quite quickly. They change from leader to leader. But a lot of these elements that we saw today will continue to flourish throughout the rest of French history.